Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for Literature and Coping Skills. We are meeting for the first time. This is lecture number 1, in which I'm going to walk you through the idea of existential concerns, their impact on human existence, their causes, and how we can overcome these problems. So it's very, very important for all of us to understand the idea of existential concern and existential anxieties so that we can begin to take care of those issues. And once we are able to do so, we'll be in a better place to face the challenges of life. So we're going to focus on existential concern today. So, as you all know, when it comes to human existence, it is full of problems. At the same time, we also have a lot of things to bank upon. But when it comes to problems, we tend to lose our patience and become uncertain and confused. So we all know that as long as we humans continue to exist, we will continue to experience these existential concerns. So what are these existential concerns? It's very, very important for us to know them first. These existential concerns arise because we treat life as a meaning-making process. The moment we are born and begin to grow, we try to ascribe meaning to everything that we do, so that our life becomes meaningful, our existence becomes meaningful. So, as we begin to live, we create our stories of optimism and pessimism, because whenever we find it good, we find it to our liking, we like that situation. We do not face any problems, we do not face any challenges. But the moment we begin to experience disturbing emotions, challenges, we would become pessimistic. So, all our life, we continue to see the struggle between optimism on one hand and pessimism on the other. So, we become contented, happy and optimistic, hopeful at certain times, and at other times we also become very, very pessimistic, sad, and we begin to withdraw from the activities of life. So, it's a continuous process. As long as we live, we have to pass through these processes, and these are some of those existential concerns. And these existential concerns grow stronger when we are faced with the emotions that challenge our contentment, our happy state. And these are the emotions like fear, loss, sadness, anger and guilt. So these are some of the strongest emotions that are very, very disturbing, because they always push us backwards. So we do not know what to do, and we suddenly tend to lose our cool, lose our patience. We become so uncertain about our lives, our existence, and a variety of other things. So these are some of the most important existential concerns. And then when we are faced with these existential concerns, we begin to grapple, we begin to struggle with suffering, burden, loneliness and meaninglessness, because we do not know what to do about how to take care of those existential questions and existential concerns. So we start to suffer, we experience that burden, we are overwhelmed by a sense of loneliness and a sense of meaninglessness. So we are constantly embroiled in the struggle of being versus non-being. As I've already told you, the moment we become happy, so we are within our being. And the moment we are not happy, we are challenged by existential issues, existential problems or disturbing emotions. We think that we are losing a grip over our lives, and we begin to struggle. So, and we tend to believe that this being is in fact a non-being. It is of no use, it is meaningless, it is absolutely useless. So when we look at the whole idea of existential concerns, we know that we are going to face them no matter what, because they are so inextricable in our lives that we cannot separate them from us. So it's all about experiencing them depending on the kind of emotional state that we find ourselves in. Because if we are in a happy state, contented state, then we'll not experience those existential concerns. But the moment we are not in those states, we begin to experience fear, loss, sadness, anger, and guilt. I must tell you all that existential concerns are very closely associated with the idea of our existence, because those are the concerns that cannot be separated from our existence. So the moment we understand, we realize that death is the ultimate existential reality that is going to put an end to this life, we begin to experience the related emotions like fear, loss, sadness, anger, guilt, loneliness, meaninglessness, and we begin to suffer. So that brings us to the idea of the 5 existential concerns, that are the big ones. So therefore they are called the big 5 existential concerns. So when we look at each of them, we'll understand how these existential concerns in fact affect our lives a great deal. So let's take a look at the first existential concern, which is death. So death is the ultimate reality of human existence. We all know that the moment we are born, we are moving towards death. Death is the limiter, it's the biggest limiter of human existence or human life. So the moment we become aware of the inevitability of death, that creates a whole lot of problems for us, because we try to understand the idea of death in connection with our desire for continued existence. Because we think we are born to exist, but the moment we become aware that death is going to put an end to all this, and that's going to create a whole lot of problems for us. So death happens to be one of the biggest existential concerns. Then an equally important existential concern is isolation. So we humans experience and feel the need to remain connected. And that's one big reason why humans are very rightly called social creatures, because we live in a society in which we come in contact with each other and we try to attribute sense to our existence. So it's very important that we understand that we cannot remain in an isolated state. We cannot live lonely or alone. So therefore, we always vie for relationships that will make us feel connected, that will make us feel comfortable. So that's the reason why we treat isolation as a big existential concern. Because the moment we believe that we are being rejected and we are not being able to experience or express our subjective experience of reality accurately with others, that's going to create a whole lot of problems for us. So this is the second big existential concern. There is a third big existential concern which is equally challenging for each one of us, because identity formation begins the moment we are born. So we need to have a clear sense of who we are and whether we fit into the scheme of things in the world. And the moment we know that there is a lot of uncertainties because of certain conflicts between self aspects and the unclear boundaries between self and non-self and limited self-insight, now all these issues together pose a great amount of challenge to the process of identity formation. But that goes on, the process never stops, but it passes through various stages of conflict and struggle. And that creates a lot of existential concern in us. We can now move on to a fourth existential concern, that is freedom. We all know that we enjoy a lot of freedom, I mean a great amount of freedom. So we have a free will and we are born free, if I have to quote Rousseau. But he also went on to say that we are tied everywhere. We are bound by chains everywhere. So why did he think so? Because the moment we are born, we have to enter into a social contract for which we have to surrender a substantial part of our freedom so that we can become a member of the society that we live in. Apart from that, there is something else that also creates a lot of problem for us when it comes to the question of freedom, because if we have free will, that means we are free to choose our lives, we are free to design our lives, we are free to make our own choices and go for the things that we like. But that's not an easy process. That brings a lot of responsibility onto us. While we know that we are free to choose things on our behalf, it's also important for each one of us to understand that we are also responsible for the choices that we make. So that makes it a complex array of alternatives. On one hand, we enjoy free will. On the other, we are overwhelmed by the idea of responsibility. We cannot say that I'm free to make choices, but I'm not ready to go for the responsibilities. That cannot be. So freedom comes with the idea of responsibility for the choices that we make. Therefore, it's very, very difficult for us to own our freedom completely, because we know it is not completely freedom. So therefore, we experience these existential concerns, because while we would like to make our free choices, we would not like to own those responsibilities for our choices. So that's how freedom is the fourth big existential concern. And then we come to the idea of meaning. We begin with the idea that this life is meaningful, but this life is not meaningful whenever it is faced with challenges. So therefore, it is embroiled in a struggle, and the struggle is waged between the desire to believe that life is meaningful on one hand, and on the other, the events and the experiences that unfold as life progresses. And these events and experiences tend to be inconsistent at times, and that's how they pose a lot of challenges to our meaning-making process, because it's not easy for us to know and realize that meaning can also become meaningless. So therefore, we have the desire to believe that this life is meaningful, but then there are several occasions on which we experience and we realize that life is rapidly losing its meaning. It's suddenly becoming meaningless, and it has lost any meaning. So we lose optimism, we lose hope, we lose faith, we lose trust in life, and that promptly takes us back to the first big existential concern, that is death. So we think that if life is meaningless and it is going to be shortened, it is going to be limited by death, then there is absolutely no need to do anything, to take any initiative or to go for any action. So all these ideas are in fact big existential concerns, starting with death, then isolation, identity, freedom and meaning. These are the 5 biggest existential concerns for humans. So that brings us to the ideas of a very famous existential psychotherapist, Irvin Yalum, who in fact brought existential psychotherapy into the forefront of modern psychotherapy, because he wanted to focus on the redressal of existential concerns of human beings. And that's the reason why he talked about these existential concerns and how we humans can take care of each of those concerns so that we emerge triumphant and we lead a meaningful life. He was also of the same opinion that these are the most important and significant existential concerns of humans, starting with death, freedom, existential isolation, and meaninglessness. We have already discussed these ideas. Just to give you a recap of what Yalum meant by each of these basic existential concerns of humans. So, as I've already told you, death, the very idea of death, gives us a kind of a shudder that everything is going to end. Death is going to put an end to all our initiatives, all our enterprises and endeavors. If that is the case, then there is absolutely no need for us to do anything. If we all are going to die, then where is the need to do anything in life? This life becomes absolutely meaningless the moment we know that death is the ultimate reality. It's going to put an end. It's going to drop the curtains on our life. So everything becomes meaningless right at that moment. Then the idea of freedom, we have already talked about the idea of freedom, that we all are free, there is no doubt about it, but everywhere we are in chains, and those chains bring about a lot of responsibilities for us. We need to take care of those responsibilities. Unless we do so, we cannot enjoy freedom. We have to shed this choice. And then existential isolation, as you know by now, that we all are humans who want to remain connected all the times. So unless we remain connected, it will be very, very difficult for each one of us to live. We cannot live in separation from each other, in isolation from each other, and we cannot live alone. So therefore, it's important that we understand that we need people around us with whom we can connect, we can relate to, and we can attribute some sense to our lives. And then, if we can take care of these three important and significant existential concerns, we can overcome the fourth existential concern, that is meaninglessness. Because everything turns out to be meaningless the moment we think that death is going to end our lives. Freedom is fraught with responsibilities, therefore we do not enjoy freedom to the fullest. Isolation is something that is inherent, that turns out to be natural, because we cannot express all our subjective experiences to everyone around us. Therefore, we will feel isolated. Besides, if we cannot connect with others around us, that will lead to a lot of isolation for us. So all the three together create the idea of meaninglessness. So if we cannot ascribe meaning to our lives, this life will become unbearable. We cannot live it. So therefore, it's very, very important that we know how to attribute meaning to our existence. And this can happen only when we find ourselves in a position to take care of these existential concerns. So with that in mind, we can now move to the next segment of this lecture, that is existential anxiety. So as you all know, existential concerns, the very awareness of these concerns the very realization of the idea that these are the most significant existential concerns, starting with death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, and a variety of other things. The moment we become aware of these concerns, that is a beginning of the experience of existential anxiety. We are bound to experience existential anxiety unless we free ourselves from the burden of these existential concerns. But I don't mean to say that we can free ourselves completely. There is no way we can free ourselves. We can get rid of these existential concerns. That is an impossibility. These concerns will continue to be with us as long as we exist. So that's not the idea. The idea is not to separate them or to push them aside so that they never return to our lives to disturb us. That's not the idea. The idea is to become aware of those concerns and become aware in a way so that we can overcome the anxiety that is caused by the very awareness of these concerns. So let's focus on existential anxiety. So why do we experience existential anxiety? Because of the struggle that we wage to find meaning in the face of meaninglessness. As I've already told you, the moment we become aware of these existential concerns, we develop a sense of meaninglessness surrounding life, our existence, because we begin to think that our life is meaningless. It has no meaning at all. Whatever we are doing will go completely waste and will not get anything in return. So this is all a meaningless endeavor. It's a hopeless enterprise. So that begins the struggle for meaning in the face of meaninglessness, because we all know that we cannot allow death to put an end to our lives untimely, because we know we exist, we have a life which will be curtailed, which will be ended by death. But before that happens, we have a certain span that we can spend ascribing meaning to our lives. So therefore, the struggle. We struggle to find meaning in the face of meaninglessness. And the second is the question that has to do with our identity. Why we are here, our identity and our purpose. Why we are here, what am I doing here? What is the meaning of my existence? Who am I? What I am going to do? So these are some of the questions that we face so that we can evaluate our purpose, the purpose of our existence on this earth. So existential anxiety is a result of our struggle to find meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to find an answer to the question as to why we are here, what we are doing here, who we are, and a variety of other questions. And finally, the whole idea to evaluate our purpose, because we cannot lead a purposeless life. That will be even more difficult to live. So the moment we allow these existential concerns lead to or result in some existential anxiety, these questions will arise automatically. And when these questions arise, we need to find answers to each one of them so that we can help ourselves overcome existential anxiety. So, if our thoughts over the existential concerns become persistent, that means if we continue to think not about life but about death, not about meaning but about meaninglessness, not about freedom but about the responsibilities that come with freedom, then we know that we are experiencing existential concerns, because they will become persistent, They will become overly intrusive. They will continue to disturb us. They'll continue to return to us and haunt us. And that's how they're going to negatively impact our well-being. Our functional being or our well-being will begin to withdraw from life's activities, will begin to become pessimistic, will begin to lose hope, will see a drop in our motivational levels, and a variety of other things. So it's very, very important for us to understand that existential concerns are resulting in existential anxiety for us. When we realize that they are becoming persistent, overly intrusive, and they begin to negatively impact our well-being, we live in a state of disturbance. So we must be aware of these challenges. Once we are aware of these challenges, then it will be easy for us to understand that we are experiencing existential anxiety, and we can plan out how to overcome these existential anxieties so that we can begin to live. So these are again some of the most significant signs of existential anxiety, because you know, when you experience stress, confusion, mood drop, hopelessness, emptiness, and lack of motivation, you need to be certain that you are being bogged down by existential anxiety. As we all know, stress, I'm talking about the negative stress that's going to cause a lot of problems for us. So when we know that we are experiencing stress continuously, we find ourselves in stressed conditions all the time, then we know that's a sign of existential anxiety. And when we begin to remain in a state of confusion, for example, I do not know what I am supposed to do, I don't understand, I don't comprehend, I don't believe, I don't trust people, but I don't know why it is happening to me. So that's a state of confusion in which we find ourselves in. Then we know that's a sign of existential anxiety. Mood drop, we know. Now we are elated, we feel like doing things, we are enthusiastic about certain actions, certain projects, but after a while we experience a sudden drop in the mood. Now I'm happy, after a while I become sad, I become angry, I begin to cry, I become frustrated, I feel like tearing my hair. So then you suddenly know there's a mood drop. That is a sign of existential anxiety. And then hopelessness. You feel like doing things, but hopelessness doesn't allow you to do that, even attempt that. Because, you know, it will be useless. It will lead to nothing. So the idea of nothingness will take over your hope and you'll become hopeless. So hopelessness, if experienced continuously, then you know that's existential anxiety. And then emptiness, that is nothingness. There is nothing in my life. My life is an empty vessel. It has no meaning, it has no purpose, it has no direction. It has nothing at all. So my life is absolutely a waste. So the moment you begin to experience emptiness in your life, that is a sign of existential anxiety. And then finally, the lack of motivation. You would like to do things, but you will not have the requisite motivation to do so, because you will not be motivated at all. You will not be motivated to live, you will not be motivated to act, do things when it comes to your studies, your exams, your relationships. Everything that you do requires a certain amount of motivation so that you allow yourself to get into the things and make them happen. So you allow yourself to take on the challenges and overcome them successfully. If that doesn't happen, that means you lack motivation. For even the smallest things in our life, we need some kind of motivation. Unless there is motivation, we cannot do it. So, lack of motivation will mean that you are experiencing existential anxiety. So, we need to be very, very careful about these signs. These are the most important signs of existential anxiety. There are other signs as well, but they are not as significant as these signs. These are prominently experienced and noticeable signs. So, therefore, it's very important that we wake up to these signs, we take note of these signs, so that we can think of taking care of these conditions. We know that we all will experience existential concerns. I have already told you all that. There is no escape from that. As long as we live, as long as we exist, we are bound to experience existential concerns. That's not a problem. That's very common. Everyone who exists is bound to experience existential concerns. Everyone who experiences existential concerns will also pass through stages of existential anxiety. That's also a reality. We are bound to experience existential anxiety. There is no escape from it. But that's not the question. The question is there a way to overcome these issues and these problems? If we cannot overcome these problems, that will lead to permanent hopelessness, which is not a reality. In fact, we can overcome these concerns and existential anxiety. Therefore, I call this the exit path. We can always exit existential anxiety. If we cannot stop it from happening to us, we can exit through a certain dedicated or well-designed path, which will allow us to promptly and smoothly exit our existential anxiety and begin to live life. So, let's take a look at what are those exit pathways. So, it's all about acceptance and action, because until and unless I accept the realities of my life, it will be very difficult for me to live. The realities of my existence must be accepted before I can go for an authentic and fully loaded existence, unless I accept it. So, acceptance is a very, very important thing. So, when it comes to negative emotions, challenges, uncertainties, confusions, meaninglessness, hopelessness, mood drops, the idea of death or the fear of death, I must accept that these are the realities of my life, my existence. So, my exit mode begins with my acceptance. If I continue to run away, escape, that will not ensure that these realities will disappear. They will never disappear. So, it's always a good idea to accept that these realities are here to exist. They are a vital aspect of my existence. So, it's a better idea for me to accept it. In the same way as we accept a lot of things about ourselves, and you all know the moment we accept it, then things become easier for us to manage. So, that is the idea. So, acceptance. Once I accept, then I can think of some action through which I can overcome those issues, those problems. So, therefore, these two are the most important skills. I must call them coping skills that we need to cultivate in ourselves. Since this course is about coping skills, I must start with these two important coping skills, acceptance and action. Because if I cannot accept, I will fail. If I cannot act, I'll also fail. So, it's a choice between success and failure. So, I think we must all go for success, not failure. We all want that. Therefore, we must begin with acceptance. which will lead us to action. So let's now take a look at those issues. We must first begin by telling ourselves that these experiences are common. Which experiences? These existential concerns, existential anxiety are common. Although we all are unique individuals, we are different from each other in a variety of ways, still there are certain experiences that are very, very common to each one of us. So we must begin by accepting the fact that there is no individual who is free from these concerns and the anxiety. The moment we accept that, it will be easier for us to understand. That's the first step we need to take. And the second is, we must also understand that our existence has an uncertain feature. It is very, very uncertain in nature. So we cannot ensure certainty. It cannot be a constant thing. I cannot ensure that I'll continue to be happy over a certain period of time or until the end of my life. Nobody can assure that or even ensure that. It's very, very difficult. It's so uncertain. I don't exactly know what will happen tomorrow. That's not the question. The question is, if something happens tomorrow which I do not find to my liking, which I'm not comfortable with, am I prepared enough to face? Okay, if something good happens to me, it will be easy for me to accept it. If that doesn't happen, it becomes very, very difficult for me to accept it. So therefore, it's very important that I take care of the things that happen to me. So I must also accept the fact that my choices can lead to either success or failure. My choices will lead to something which is inseparable from my choice, because once I make a choice, it will either lead me to success or failure. If it leads me to success, fine, it's acceptable to me, it's acceptable to everybody. If it leads to failure, that becomes unacceptable. Most people, I mean everyone, finds it very, very difficult to accept it. Why should it lead to failure? We are not ready to accept failure. We all are ready to embrace success, but not accept failure. But that's not the thing. We must accept that our choices will lead us either to success or failure. We cannot help it. Therefore, it's important that we accept the results of our success, irrespective of whether they end in failure or success. So the results of our choice need to be accepted. Then we come to the actions that we need to go for, need to perform in order to overcome existential anxiety. The first thing that we need to do is to invest on relationships, because we must also realize that loneliness, existential isolation is one of the biggest challenges for human existence. So therefore, it's very, very important that we begin to invest on relationships so that we are not left lonely at any point of time in our lives. So therefore, it's always a good idea to invest on relationships, including your family members, your friends, and your mentors, your well-wishers, so that this relationship continues throughout our lives, and this is definitely going to make our life livable, bearable, and it will give hope to our existence. So that's a very important thing to do. And then we need to find meaning and contentment in everyday things. Most often, for the sake of those bigger goals, we separate ourselves from the everyday things that have a lot of meaning for us. So we begin to ignore them. because we are focused on those bigger goals. And we all know that those bigger goals, as they are bigger, they are going to exercise a tremendous amount of pressure on us, and that will lead to existential anxiety as well. So bigger goals definitely lead us to existential anxiety. So if we begin to take note of everyday things, their relevance for our lives, their importance for our lives, then we'll begin to find contentment in those everyday things. That will definitely take away a lot of pressure from us. And then, this is one of the most important things to do. We need to talk through. Most often, whenever we are faced with challenges, we decide to withdraw, we decide to recoil, we decide to gradually recede into loneliness. That's not going to help. So if I can talk through, if I can find people whom I trust, and if I can express my feelings, if I can share my experiences with them, that's definitely going to help me a lot. And this is one of the biggest problems, because most people do not know what to do when they are faced with challenges. When they begin to experience existential anxiety, when they begin to experience emptiness, meaninglessness in their lives, they do not know what to do about it, because they think it will be very, very humiliating and embarrassing for them to find people and discuss their problems with them, because of the fear of being tagged negatively. And that's one big reason why most people stay away from talking. So talking is a therapy. So therefore, if we can talk through, that's definitely going to help us overcome our existential anxiety. So that is how we come to the end of this lecture. There is another part of it. In the second lecture, we're also going to talk about existential concerns, but through a very different perspective. I'm going to focus on a variety of things, starting with different types of existential modes and the different types of instincts that we all are moved by or driven by. At the same time, I'm also going to talk about two great poems, one by Bhartrihari and the other by Rabindranath Tagore. And with the help of those two poems, I'm going to show you how we can overcome our existential anxiety. So you can take a look at these references from which these ideas in today's lecture have been derived. So thank you for being with me. So I hope you have enjoyed, you have understood the ideas better. So when we meet next, we are going to take our ideas of existential concerns yet further. So thank you again for joining me.